God is always faithful in keeping his promises. And we learned that we can trust him to keep his promises and his word no matter what. By contrast, we also noted that people, including us, often don't keep their word, and they fail to follow through on our promises, but God is perfect. Plain and simple, he never fails. But you've probably heard the phrase, talk is cheap. For example, if I promised all of you that next week I would give you $100 each just for attending our service, only for you to show up and me to say, haha, just kidding, you would quickly realize that I was all talk and no action, right? And by the way, I am not saying I will pay you $100 next week to show up. I will stand by my word on that one. But the truth is that our words, or the words that we say, carry a lot of meaning. So it's really important that we understand the words that we use. So tonight, I want us to consider one very specific word, and that is love. For as loaded of a word as it can be, we actually use the word love a lot, don't we? For example, we talk about how we love things like our favorite foods, such as I love pizza. We talk about how we love certain experiences, such as Ron loves going to Taylor Swift concerts.
That's just wrong.
And we also talk about how we love our families. For example, I tell Jessica and my kids that I love them every day. But I don't love a good pepperoni pizza like I love Jessica or my kids. And just to be clear, I've never actually told a pepperoni pizza that I love it.
I have.
That would just be weird. But instead, I demonstrate that love by ordering a pepperoni pizza, taking it home, and devouring it. When we say we love someone or something, we mean drastically different things depending on who or what we are talking about. And beyond that, what if I were to tell Jessica and my kids that I love them every day, but I never did anything to demonstrate that love? What if I said I love them, but never showed them love through my actions? That doesn't really sound like love, does it? To me, that sounds like all talk and no action. So tonight we are wrapping up our series, Keep It Simple, where we have been discussing how to understand the basics of our spiritual lives so we don't make things any more complicated than they need to be. We've been talking about God's big three, the three things that are vital to our walk with Jesus. And remember, Paul said that these would last forever. If you remember 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 13 says, three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. The greatest of these is what? Love. So just like Paul, we have saved the best for last. And it's so important that we understand what love is, and to do that, we're going to keep it simple by looking no further than what the Bible says about it. And let's start with the words of Jesus from a passage from the Gospel of John. John chapter 13, verse 33 says, "Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I am going. So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Here, Jesus is talking to his closest, most trusted disciples not long before he would be arrested and ultimately crucified on the cross. And I've always imagined this as Jesus being very purposeful about making sure that he shared these important words with his disciples as his time with them was winding down. And while this passage only has a few sentences, make no mistake, it is absolutely packed with truth, not only for Jesus' disciples, but for us. So let's jump in. Let's see what we can learn from Jesus' words almost 2,000 years ago. The first truth that I want you to know or to highlight tonight is this. Love is a command. Love each other was Jesus' command to his disciples. And what was this quality of love? Was it like others say when they say, hey, I love pizza? No, I'm going to go out on a limb and say no. But then what did Jesus mean? Thankfully, he didn't leave it to chance. Instead, Jesus told them to love others as he had loved them. So we are commanded to love each other with a Jesus-like, Jesus-level love. And to be clear, this is not a small, insignificant kind of love. And we know that because love was one of the ideas that Jesus talked about the most. For example, in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus was asked what he thought was the greatest commandment out of the hundreds of commandments that were in the Old Testament. And here's how that conversation went. Matthew chapter 22, verse 36. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. What did Jesus say was our number one priority?
You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul,
Right.
all your mind.
We should be loving God with all of our hearts, our souls, and minds. That's correct. And then, did you catch it? He said that it should be followed closely by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Loving others as ourselves should be our second highest priority. So when Jesus says to his disciples, so now I am giving you a new commandment, love each other, this is a command that we should take incredibly seriously. Another truth from this passage that I want to highlight is this. Number 2, love is an action. We often think of love as a feeling, an emotion, but I don't think that that is the picture that Jesus is painting here. Now, to be sure, love will most likely result in a feeling and emotions, but the love that the Bible is describing is not a feeling. It is an action. And one of the ways that we know this is that Jesus didn't say to love each other. He said to love each other just as I have loved you. Now, did Jesus really like his disciples? Sure, of course he did. But the love that he showed them and you and I is so much more than that. It was active. This is how Jesus' love was described in the book of 1 John, chapter 3 and verse 16. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. Jesus went way beyond simply showing his affection when he acted in love by giving his life for us. And this is the standard that he is calling us to. If we are to love others in the same way that Jesus loves us, it's going to require a lot more than just feelings or emotions. When Jesus described what it meant to love our neighbor as ourselves, he told a story that I'm sure all of y'all have heard. There's the story of the Good Samaritan. And in this story, if you remember, Jesus highlighted the actions of a Samaritan man who stopped and selflessly cared for a man who had been robbed and beaten. Two religious men who passed by did absolutely nothing to help. The Samaritan didn't just feel something. He did something. Sure, love makes you feel, but it's not a feeling. Love is an action. And the third thing that I want you to know tonight is this. Love for others is proof of our love for God. Let's go back to see how Jesus finished the passage that we read earlier. And here's what he said in verse 35. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Here, Jesus told the disciples how the world would know how they were his disciples, that their love for others would prove it. If they loved each other the way Jesus had loved them, it would be obvious to everyone else that they were people who were following in Jesus' footsteps. And the same is true for us. Genuinely loving others is the greatest proof that we also love and want to be like Jesus. But by the way, not loving each other is also proof of something else, and it's not good. John wrote this in 1 John chapter 4. If someone says, I love God, but hates a fellow believer, that person is a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? And he has given us this command: those who love God must also love their fellow believers. When we don't love others, it proves that we don't truly love God. These are incredibly strong words from John. If our entire relationship with God means loving him, but we never actively love others, there's a 100% chance that we don't actually have the relationship with God that we say we do. Saying that we love God while not loving others means we are deceiving ourselves and claiming to be something that we are not. Of God's big three, faith, hope, and love is by far the greatest. It's more than a feeling. Love is an action. But if we want to love God well, where do we start? What steps do we take? Well, there's a passage at the end of the Old Testament that I think gives us three great places to start. Here's what Micah chapter 6 and verse 8 says. O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So let's take a quick look at each step and see how we might put these into practice tonight. And the first step we need to do is do what is right. I know this sounds overly simple, but that's actually because it is that simple, if we let it be that simple. When we're faced with a choice where one way is right and one way is wrong, we are called to be people who always choose what is right. The challenge is that we're not only called to do what is right for ourselves, but that Jesus commands us to love others as ourselves. So that means that we just can't put ourselves first. Another way to describe this is that we need to be people who seek to do justice, especially when it's on behalf of others or someone else who might not be able to seek justice on their own. It means being the kind of people who stand up and choose to speak up for others when they're being bullied. We must speak up for others when they are being oppressed. We must be the kind of people who are not willing to wait for someone else to do something. We need to be the kind of person who helps make things better. And this is the tough part. There are times when seeking justice and doing right means that we need to be ready and willing to sacrifice our own comfort and our own desires for the sake of others. And this is the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated when he gave his life for us. And it's the kind of love that he is calling us to show others. So not only should we seek to do what's right, but if we want to love others, we can choose to love mercy. Now, I know how this is about to sound, but I think that most of us in this room, we already love mercy, especially when it's being shown to us. Because, mercy is what we experience when we aren't given the punishment that we deserve. And receiving mercy feels incredible. It's such a relief to know that the weight of punishment is taken off of our shoulders. But if we truly love mercy, we will desire mercy to be shown to everyone, even those who have wronged us. Loving mercy and desiring mercy for others, especially when they have wronged us, is an incredible display of love. But it doesn't happen by accident. It's just not within our nature. Usually when we're wrong, we want the other person to be punished. We want them to be sorry, and we want them to mean it when they tell us that they are sorry. But loving mercy means choosing a different response. And it's a choice that's best made before ever needing to prove it. If we choose to become people who are determined to show mercy, we will be ready to show it when the time comes. And one last step that we can choose to take if we want to love others well is to number 3, walk humbly with our God. Humility unlocks our ability to love others well. But it's one of the most challenging qualities to cultivate in our own lives. And it's even more challenging to make it second nature to us. And please hear me when I say that I'm still working on this. I haven't achieved it by a long shot, but there's a trick I've learned that I want to share with you. And it's when I regularly remind myself of how God has shown me mercy in my life, it makes it easier for me to show mercy to others. When someone does something to hurt me or makes me angry, it's so easy to immediately jump to the conclusion that they are wrong and that they need to be punished. But humility means being able to take a step back, to consider that the other person might not be the only one in the wrong. Humility means being able to own your own shortcomings and admit that you don't know everything, and see that others might be going through a lot of the same struggles that you are. As we walk humbly with God, we start to fully realize what God has saved us from, and that God is still working on us. Embracing humility means realizing that each of us still has more room to grow. Walking humbly with our God unlocks our ability to love others well, regardless of how we feel about what they do or say or even think. And believe me when I tell you that I know how difficult it is to put all of this into action. But love is an action. And it's an action that God is calling each and every one of us to. If you want to love God, it doesn't get any simpler than loving people. It is simple to say and understand, but not always simple to do. But it is worth the effort. And I pray that out of our love for God and for others, that we will seek to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God.